The morning the coffin was supposed to arrive at the Deadhorse Junction depot, a woman stepped off the train instead, and the whole town would spend the next year trying to understand how a man who ordered a bride to save his ranch ended up saving her life, and how she, in turn, saved something in him that he thought had died in a Kansas cornfield 10 years before. If you believe kindness can still change a broken heart, if you believe faith and second chances still matter in this hard world, then before you go any further, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you're still out there believing in stories like this one. Now let us begin. The dust of Montana Territory in the spring of 1881 was the color of old wheat, and it clung to everything: the boots, the wagon wheels, the grief that Thomas Whitfield carried like a stone in his chest. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from years of fence work and cattle drives, with a face that had once been quick to smile before the fever took his wife Sarah and their infant son in the same terrible week 3 winters past. Since then, the Whitfield Ranch had become a place of silence. The hands still worked the herd, the cattle still grazed the open range beneath the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, but the house itself had gone quiet as a church after the last hymn is sung. It was his sister, Martha, who finally convinced him that a man could not run 3,000 acres and raise no children and bury himself in work forever without losing whatever remained of his soul. She was the one who wrote the advertisement that ran in a Chicago newspaper, seeking a wife willing to relocate to the Montana frontier, a woman of good character, capable of ranch work, willing to build a life in hard country. Thomas had not written a single word of it himself. He had only, after weeks of arguing, agreed to meet the train. What he did not know, what nobody in Deadhorse Junction knew, was that the woman who answered that advertisement was not entirely who her letters claimed her to be. Her name, she wrote, was Charlotte Reyes, 26 years old, orphaned young, raised by an aunt in Ohio, skilled in cooking, sewing, and simple bookkeeping. All of that was true enough. What her letters did not say was that Charlotte had spent the last 4 years working the back rooms of a St. Louis gambling hall, first as a seamstress mending torn coats and dresses, and later, when the money ran thin, dealing cards to men who did not expect a woman's hands to be so quick or so honest. She had seen more of the world's cruelty in those smoke-filled rooms than most frontier wives would see in a lifetime, and she had learned, above all else, that a woman alone must be harder than the men around her or she would be devoured whole. When the gambling hall burned in a fire that killed 2 men and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small tin box of savings, Charlotte had seen the advertisement pinned to a boarding house wall, torn from that same Chicago paper, and something in her had simply decided. She was going west. She was going to become someone new. And if a rancher in Montana wanted a soft, obedient bride who would ask no questions and cause no trouble, then he was about to be sorely disappointed, because Charlotte Reyes had sworn to herself, standing in the ashes of that burned building, that she would never again be a woman who bent herself small to survive a man's expectations. The train pulled into Deadhorse Junction beneath a sky the color of a healing bruise, purple and gold at the edges, and Thomas stood on the platform in his one good coat, turning his hat over and over in his hands like a man waiting for a verdict. When Charlotte stepped down from the passenger car, she was not what he expected, not delicate, not shy, not eager to please. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a horse she is considering buying, evaluating, unhurried, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady and dry as the wind off the plains. She told him plainly that she was not there to be rescued, and that if he expected some weeping, grateful bride to fall into his arms, he had wasted his money on the train fare. Thomas, who had buried a wife who adored him and had loved him gently every day of their marriage, did not know what to make of this woman at all. He drove her to the ranch in near total silence, the wagon creaking over the rutted road, the cattle lowing somewhere beyond the fence line, and when they arrived at the house, Charlotte simply looked at it, the sagging porch, the dust-caked windows, the untended garden, and said that it needed work, and that she supposed she could manage it, though she made no promise of warmth, no promise of love, nothing but competence. The first months were a battle disguised as a marriage. Charlotte refused to be idle, refused to wait meekly for instruction, and threw herself into the running of the household with a fierceness that unsettled the ranch hands and quietly impressed them in equal measure. She learned to shoot a rifle within a week, not because Thomas taught her, but because she watched the foreman, a weathered old cowboy named Amos Whitcomb, teach the younger hands, and she simply picked up a spare rifle and matched them shot for shot until Amos, laughing despite himself, admitted she had a truer eye than half his men. She kept the books for the ranch with a precision that startled Thomas, catching an error in the feed supplier's ledger that had been cheating him for 2 years, an error she spotted not through any innocent virtue but because she had spent years learning to read numbers the way other people read faces, watching for the lie hidden inside them. Thomas, for his part, watched all of this with a strange, aching confusion. He had wanted, if he was honest with himself, someone to fill Sarah's absence, someone soft and gentle who would let the house breathe again with quiet domestic peace. Instead, he had gotten a woman who argued with him about cattle prices, who refused to attend the church social because she said the town women looked at her like she was something dragged in on the wind, and who slept in the small room at the end of the hall rather than share his bed, a boundary she set on the very first night, and never once wavered from. There were evenings he sat alone on the porch, watching the sun bleed out over the mountains, and felt a bitterness rise in him that this stranger had come into his home and refused to be the balm he so desperately needed. But there were other moments too, moments that crept up on him unannounced. He found her once in the barn near midnight, sitting beside a sick calf that the vet had given up on, pressing a damp cloth to its fevered flank, murmuring to it in a low voice he had never heard her use with any person. He found the tin box she kept hidden beneath her floorboards, not out of snooping but by accident when a storm loosened a board, and inside it were not jewels or money but a single faded photograph of a young girl who resembled Charlotte enough to be a sister, and a rosary worn smooth from handling. He did not ask her about it. He simply nailed the board back down and said nothing, and something in that small act of restraint began, slowly, to shift the ground between them. The turning came in the hard way that trouble always comes to frontier country, swift, and without warning. A band of cattle rustlers had been working the territory that summer, striking ranches along the Bitterroot foothills, and in July they struck the Whitfield spread, running off nearly 40 head in a single night, and leaving one of the young hands, a boy named Josiah Carter no older than 19, shot through the shoulder and bleeding in the dirt. Thomas rode out with Amos and 3 other men to track them, leaving Charlotte at the house with instructions to bolt the doors and keep the rifle loaded, and it was during that long, terrible night, with Josiah laid out on the kitchen table and fever setting into his wound, that Charlotte revealed the parts of herself she had spent months trying to bury. She did not panic. She had seen gunshot wounds before, in the back rooms of the gambling hall where disputes were sometimes settled with more than harsh words, and she worked with a calm precision that astonished the ranch wife who had come to help, cutting away the boy's shirt, packing the wound with clean cloth soaked in whiskey, talking to him in a low, steady voice the entire time to keep him from slipping into the dark. When the fever spiked near dawn and the boy began to thrash and cry out for his mother, Charlotte held him down with a strength that belied her frame and sang to him, quietly, a hymn her aunt had taught her long ago in Ohio, and it was this, the singing, the tenderness beneath the steel, that Thomas walked in on when he returned at first light, exhausted and grim from a chase that had ended without recovering the cattle. He stood in the doorway and watched his wife, this woman who had told him plainly she wanted no part of tenderness, cradling a dying boy's head in her lap and praying over him as though he were her own blood, and something in Thomas's chest broke open like ice giving way to spring water. Josiah lived, in the end, thanks in no small part to Charlotte's steady hands, and word of what she had done spread through Deadhorse Junction faster than any gossip about her sharp tongue or her refusal to attend socials. The town women who had once looked at her with suspicion began, slowly, to soften, and Charlotte, though she would never admit it aloud, found herself unexpectedly moved by the shy gratitude of Josiah's mother, who arrived at the ranch with a basket of bread and tears in her eyes. But the rustlers were not finished with the Whitfield ranch, and the true danger was yet to come. Thomas learned, through a contact in town, that the men responsible were led by a former ranch hand named Silas Boone, a man he himself had fired 2 years prior for drunkenness and cruelty to the animals in his charge, and that Boone had been nursing his grudge ever since, gathering a small gang of desperate men left jobless by the hard winters and the collapsing beef prices. Sheriff Wyatt Coleman, a weathered lawman who had kept peace in Dead Horse Junction for nearly 15 years, rode out to the ranch himself to warn Thomas that Boone had been overheard in a saloon 2 towns over vowing to burn the Whitfield spread to the ground before the summer was out, and to take anyone standing in his way down with it. It was Charlotte, not Thomas, who first suggested that they not simply wait for the attack to come. She had spent years reading men like Boone in the gambling halls, men whose pride was their greatest weakness, men who could be baited into overreaching if you understood the shape of their anger. She proposed a plan that unsettled Thomas deeply, not because it lacked wisdom but because it required trusting her completely, something he had not yet allowed himself to do. She suggested they let it be known, through the loose talk of a stable hand they suspected of feeding information to Boone's men, that the ranch would be nearly empty on a certain night, the hands called away to help with a berthing at a neighboring spread, the perfect opportunity for a raid. In truth, Thomas, Amos, and 4 trusted hands would be waiting in the dark, along with Sheriff Coleman and 2 deputies summoned quietly from town. The night the trap was sprung was one that would be spoken of in Dead Horse Junction for years afterward, a night of gunfire cracking across the moonlit prairie, of horses screaming and men shouting, of Charlotte standing at an upstairs window with a rifle in her hands despite Thomas's furious insistence that she stay hidden in the cellar. When Boone himself broke from the chaos and made for the house, believing it undefended, it was Charlotte who met him on the porch steps with a steadiness that would haunt the man for the rest of his days, her rifle leveled and her voice cold as January, telling him that she had faced worse men than him across a card table and had never once blinked. Boone hesitated, just long enough for Sheriff Coleman to come around the corner of the barn and put an end to the standoff, taking Boone into custody along with 2 of his men while the others scattered into the night, never to trouble the territory again. In the aftermath, as the sun rose gray and gentle over a ranch scarred by gunfire but standing, Thomas found Charlotte sitting alone on the porch steps where she had faced down an outlaw, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed, the rifle still resting across her knees. He sat down beside her without a word, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the silence between them different now than it had ever been before, not the silence of strangers, but the silence of 2 people who had, without either quite intending it, become something to each other. It was Thomas who finally broke it, telling her, in a voice rough with things unsaid, that he had ordered a wife the way a man orders lumber or cattle feed, expecting something to fill an empty space, and that he was ashamed of how small that expectation had been, because the woman sitting beside him had turned out to be someone he had never once imagined and now could not imagine living without. Charlotte, who had spent her whole life guarding herself against exactly this kind of moment, found that she had no sharp words left to offer. She told him, quietly, about the girl in the photograph, her younger sister, dead of consumption before Charlotte had ever left Ohio, and how she had promised at that grave to never again let herself be small or afraid or dependent on any man's mercy, because her sister had died with nothing and no one to fight for her. She told him about the gambling hall, about the fire, about the years of hardening herself into someone who trusted no one, and she told him, with tears she had not allowed herself in years, that she was terrified of what it would mean to finally let someone in. Thomas took her hand then, gently, the first time he had done so since the day at the train platform, and told her that he did not need her to be soft, and he did not need her to be anything other than exactly what she was, because what she was had already saved his ranch, saved Josiah's life, and saved him from the slow death of a heart that had given up on ever loving again. It was not a grand declaration, not the kind of thing sung about in dime novels, but it was honest, and out on that porch, with the cattle lowing in the distance and the mountains catching the first gold light of morning, Charlotte Reyes Whitfield finally allowed herself to believe that she had not simply survived the frontier, but found a home in it. The years that followed were not without hardship, for the Montana frontier gave nothing easily and took much in return, but the Whitfield Ranch became known throughout the territory not for tragedy but for the quiet strength of the couple who ran it, and for the woman who had arrived determined to be nothing anyone expected, and had ended up becoming exactly what one broken man needed to remember how to live again. Josiah Carter grew into a fine hand and later a father himself, and he would tell his own children, decades later, about the night a gambler's daughter with a rifle and a hymn on her lips had held death at bay with nothing but her own fierce, unbending will. Before we close this story, I want to ask something of you. Wherever you are watching from tonight, whatever town or city or quiet corner of this world you call home, leave a comment and tell me where you are, and tell me too what lesson this story left with you, whether it was about the courage to be yourself, the healing power of second chances, or the quiet strength that faith can give a wounded heart. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. And if this story of Thomas and Charlotte touched something in you, if you believe that even the hardest hearts can be softened by kindness, and that even the most guarded souls deserve someone willing to see past their walls, then please, like, comment, share, and subscribe, so that stories like this one can keep finding the people who need them most. The Old West was a hard land, unforgiving and vast, but even there, even in the dust and the danger and the loneliness of the open plains, love found a way to take root, and it can find its way to you too, wherever you are, whatever storms you have survived. Until the next story, may you carry a little more faith, a little more courage, and a little more hope than you did before.